Recep Tayyip Erdogan. Likened to Viktor Orban, Donald Trump, or the Law and Justice Party in Poland, somehow he's become inextricably entwined with populism in Europe. He's become the symbol of a reinvigorated Turkey, a Turkey that once again wants to become a world power on its own. Question is though, how did Turkey, a supposedly ardently secular nation, come to embrace an avowed Islamist? This video will examine the rise of Erdogan, how he came to form the AKP, and his first major political victory in 2002. In order to understand much of what Erdogan has hoped to achieve through politics, it's important to understand the Europeanizing project of Ataturk, the founder of modern-day Turkey in 1924, and thus, crucially, Turkish secularism. Ataturk introduced top-down changes in order to cement Turkey's status as a new, modern nation-state. To this end, things like local identity and religious identification were hugely curtailed at the state level. Religious brotherhoods outlawed, and religion was relegated solely to the private sphere. Of course, deeply religious societies whose foundations for centuries have been religious, are hardly going to sequester themselves to secularism swimmingly. The 23rd of December 1930 saw a local uprising in the town of Menemen in response to the increasing vigour of Ataturk's secular reforms. A member of a Sufi religious order mustered an armed crowd in protest, with the end result being a Turkish lieutenant having his head cut off. The Turkish state's response was at once bewilderment and determination. Sufi religious orders were outlawed, the call to prayer in Arabic was forbidden, instead having to be recited in Turkish. The Quran was also, from this point onwards, only to be produced in Turkish. The idea was, if the state couldn't eliminate the irrationality of religion, it would try to control it. Ataturk was to die in 1938. His presidency was replaced by İsmet İnönü, also of Ataturk's Republican Party. Indeed, at this point, Turkey was still a one-party state, something that was about to change. In line with the trajectory towards modernization, a multi-party democracy was a necessary step. The first ever elections took place in 1946, with Ataturk's Republican People's Party winning by a landslide. However, this election is widely regarded as having been a sham. The first genuinely free elections took place 4 years later. Ataturk's Republican People's Party was ousted from power and has never been able to retake power alone since. This is something that is very important to keep in mind throughout. Despite Ataturk being remembered fondly, and despite his ideas still holding considerable clout in Turkey, especially in the military, the party was mostly considered out of touch with the population, unable to see the relevance of religion in the lives of ordinary Turks, too economically interventionist, and too entangled in reams of superfluous state bureaucracy. The opposition Democrat Party came to power under a populist message of "enough, it's the nation's turn to speak." The party mainly consisted of the more right-leaning upper echelons of the Republican People's Party splintering, and thus their time in power was characterized mostly by economic growth thanks to liberalizing the economy. The Democrat Party also laxed laws on Islam. The Arabic call to prayer was reinstated, and Imam Hatip schools were opened throughout the country, religiously oriented secondary schools for the training of religious leaders and as preparation for higher education. This was to become hugely emblematic as the status of Imam Hatip schools became hotly contested as Turkey oscillated between religion and militant secularism. The initial period under the Democrat Party was a boom for the country, albeit short-lived. It was followed by a sharp decline. Actually, the party grew increasingly authoritarian and intolerant of opposition as the economy withered. Student rallies were quashed and press freedom plummeted. The military, still a bastion of secularism, saw their opportunity to strike and precipitously overthrew the Democratic Party. 3 of the top brass were sentenced to death, including President Menderes. Menderes thus became a symbol for political dissidents that refused to toe the Kemalist line, rigidly enforced by the military. Indeed, to this day, the memory of Menderes is invoked by Erdogan and his AKP, as a ready reminder that the upper echelons are all too willing to use violence to stifle political opposition or the will of the people. This is the political environment Erdogan was born into in 1954. In 1965, Erdogan was enrolled in an Imam Hatip school in a particularly hostile climate to religious education. The Republican government that came to power in coalition with the Justice Party after the coup had pledged never to build a new Imam Hatip school, and Erdogan himself has stated that this experience made him feel like an outsider from a young age. Moreover, the 1960s were an incredibly tumultuous period for Turkey, as political divisions ravaged the country. It was this decade that many became disillusioned with left-right politics, and instead sought something entirely different. A new Turkish constitution was put in place by the military, following the coup against the Democrat Party. This instated a system of proportional representation which gave increased opportunity for new political outfits. The Democrat Party, banned in 1961, regrouped under the name of the Justice Party, who came to power in coalition with the Republicans in 1965. In tandem, the Republicans slid a bit further to the left, under the backdrop of mass public polarization. The Prime Minister at this time was Süleyman Demirel of the Justice Party, a strongly right-leaning fellow who aimed to mobilize the support of the working classes and also attempted to rally the country behind anti-communism. About this time, extreme right-wing militias and communist street movements began consuming each other throughout the country. Bombings, shootings, assassinations, riots were not obscure occurrences, and the country became dangerous and unstable. In the end, though, despite the Justice Party doing consistently well electorally, they too were ousted in a coup by memorandum in 1971. Street polarization had reached an all-time high. Violent confrontation between the far left and the far right began to cripple the Turkish economy, and the military intervened to reinstate order. Actually, with considerable public support, I may add. This is when politics in Turkey began to shift towards Islamism. The 1971 coup occurred without violence. Prime Minister Demirel acquiesced and stepped down. However, the military violently cracked down on leftist groups, jailing thousands and crippling their ability to mobilize. People began looking for alternatives to the left-right paradigm. Indeed, many saw neither ideology as appropriate for Turkey. The left was obscure and foreign, the ultra-right too enmeshed in Western ideas of the nation-state and aligned closely with America. The combination of the two proliferating in Turkey had only led to division and violence, which began to be framed as the populace being duped by foreign ideologies. Many thought a new brand of politics was necessary, the brand of Islamism. The violence throughout the 60s left Islamism relatively unscathed. Islamists successfully removed themselves from the vicious street battles of the period and instead remained insular. As a result, throughout the 1971 military crackdown, the Islamists were largely unaffected. Moreover, this period saw the formation of the first ever successful Islamist party in modern Turkish history. Necmettin Erbakan formed the National Salvation Party in 1973. Actually, this was Erbakan's second effort. In 1970, he had founded the National Order Party that was quickly banned by the military. In any case, buoyed by the political climate against leftists, but seemingly indifferent to simmering Islamism, Erbakan threw his hat in the electoral ring. Thanks to proportional representation, the elections after the 1971 coup were an utter mess, with no party being able to enter government without a coalition partner. Erbakan basically found himself kingmaker, and despite only obtaining 12% or so of the vote, managed to dictate the sway of Turkish politics. After a short-lived coalition with the left, Erbakan found his home in a right-wing coalition dubbed the Nationalist Front, that lasted until 1980. This period, thanks to Erbakan, saw the country become increasingly tolerant of Islam, as laws on secularism became laxed. Imam Hatip schools became increasingly popular, and hundreds more opened throughout the country. Moreover, the National Order Party forged ties with the right-leaning National Student Organization, of which Erdogan was a part in the mid-70s. Erdogan, with a background in the insular and religious environment of his Imam Hatip school, found a natural home in political Islamism, and by 1977 was the leader of the National Salvation Party's Istanbul youth branch. Erdogan thus cut his political teeth in the rising tide of political Islamism throughout the 70s, a movement that sharply separated itself from the violent clashes of left and right, and thus was seen as a sort of third way in a climate of political upheaval. One stark example of this occurred in 1980, following the deaths of 4 Islamists. Erdogan led a 400-strong demonstration in protest. What made said public demonstration unique was its lack of violence. When the police intervened, the Islamists did not fight back as the left and right did. Instead, they prayed. For the Islamists and for Erdogan, political change wasn't to be achieved through violence, but instead inner purification. The allure of such an ideology wasn't overlooked. Indeed, even the deeply secular military were to see the merits in Islam. As violence between the left and right ravaged the country and economic collapse devoured the living standards of the population, the military enacted a violent and suppressive coup in 1980, which basically destroyed the Turkish left forever. Hundreds of thousands were imprisoned. All major politicians, including Erdogan, were temporarily banned from politics. It was time for Islamism to fill the void. The presidency post-coup was taken by the military general Kenan Evren, who was to take a slightly different tact to Islam. His prime minister from 1983, Özal of the New Motherland Party, also rapidly transformed the Turkish state's attitude to religion. Rather than Islam being seen as something irrational and potentially subversive to the nation, Islam came to be regarded as a means of inoculating the population against left-wing ideology. This isn't to say the fate of Islamism was good. Actually, quite the opposite. Erdogan's National Salvation Party was proscribed, and throughout this decade Erdogan took a break from politics, his party outlawed. Islamism was considered an alien ideology, coming from non-Turkish philosophers and religious thinkers such as Mordadi, Sayyid Qutb and the battlefields of Afghanistan. Instead, Islam was to be controlled by the state in the form of education. The traditional values of an Islamic upbringing would hugely decrease the allure of godless Marxism. Imam Hatib schools received vastly more funding and religious education in public schools became mandatory. At the same time, Turkey tilted itself further to the west in terms of foreign policy, backing America when Saddam invaded Kuwait in 1990, and also being one of the few Islamic nations to support Israel. Point is, the 1980s saw an increasingly permissive attitude to Islam, but at the same time the country retained its Western identity and its orientation towards Europe and the United States. This allowed for Erdogan to regroup and form a new party despite his ban from politics. By the mid-80s he was rallying supporters in the face of an increasingly indifferent state attitude, under the banner of the Refah or Welfare Party. In fact, Erdogan's ban from politics was lifted come 1987. Erdogan climbed the ranks of the Refah Party quickly, becoming the party head of Istanbul by 1985. It's important at this point to elaborate on who exactly Erdogan was throughout the mid-80s, and the answer is quite simply nobody special. Outside of his party apparatus, very few of the public would have had any idea who Erdogan was. Moreover, only the most conservative of Sunni Muslims would ever have paid the Refah Party any mind. After all, only the deeply religiously inclined would ever think of voting for an Islamist party. Well, Erdogan's aim was to prove the opposite. In the city slums of Istanbul, Erdogan spotted a ripe opportunity. There was no left wing for the poor to turn to anymore, and so Erdogan transformed the party into a catch-all populist party, claiming to be the only party capable of transforming the lot of the forgotten. In 1989, Erdogan ran for the mayorship of the Istanbul district of Beyoğlu, and it was this campaign that would transform the public perception of the Refah Party. Erdogan visited pubs, even took photo ops with prostitutes, and carried himself youthfully and energetically, a far cry from the closed and introspective Islamic stereotype. Indeed, Erdogan tasked women with all the canvassing for his campaign, as his supporters and followers chanted, "One of us." Erdogan wasn't a judgmental and exclusionary political candidate. Instead, he was the only chance the common man had of representation. Erdogan didn't win the election. He lost within a hair's breadth and subsequently served a week behind bars after agitating against the judge. It didn't matter though. He had achieved his mission. The Refah Party was now a young, youthful and all-encompassing party, with Erdogan at the forefront of the public imagination. This happened at the perfect time. The early to mid-90s saw the centre-right become mired in corruption scandal after corruption scandal. Both the True Path Party and the Motherland Party quickly lost all credibility in the eyes of the public, and this lent the Refah Party with the credence it needed to charge the whole system of Turkish politics with allowing this to happen. Erdogan railed against not just the political players, but the entire political and economic structure of the country. The message of the Refah Party had evolved. It was not the lack of piety amongst the general public that was rotting Turkey from within, but instead the decadent and Western ways of the leaders, propped up by Zionist and imperialist forces. The perfect image of establishment decadence became Istanbul. Under a leftist mayor, the city's sanitation tanked. People dared not venture out without sanitation masks. Sewage spilled into the streets thanks to a workers' strike, and to make matters worse, the city was in the grips of a drought. The local elections were the first time the Refah party made a notable dent. Erdogan became the mayor of the city under the platform of Islamism. Let's not get carried away though. It wasn't a landslide. Erdogan barely won a quarter of the vote, but thanks to bitter divides, both between and within the run-of-the-mill left and right, it was enough. Erdogan rose to mayorship, and instead of moralising and pontificating on the spiritual vacuity of the populace, he got to transforming the city. At one point, he complained to a journalist, "Why do you always ask me about closing bars and brothels? Why don't you ask me about buses, rubbish collection, pollution or water?" To wit, the mayorship was a success. For cleaner air, Erdogan reduced the city's reliance on coal and expanded the gas distribution system. He provided cleaner water and built houses for the city's poor. Erdogan was not only a popular face for Islamism, but a tried and tested politician with the competency to back it up. Erbakan, on the other hand, was still enmeshed in the old ways, as were many of the upper echelons of the Refah party. Although the party had surged in support by 1996 and even delivered Erbakan to the role of Prime Minister the next year, the success was to be short-lived. The military were quick to intervene again. Sure, in the context of violence on the streets and mass bloodshed, the military were okay with utilising Islam to quell some of the baser elements of human nature, but to act permissible to an Islamist Prime Minister of a secular republic, that was a step too far. Especially so when Erbakan refused to toe the line. Tens of thousands of women marched through Ankara, protesting the rise of Sharia law, mostly in response to a Refah party official declaring Sharia would be injected into the arms of the unbelievers. The army attempted to castrate the Refah party by forcing legislation aimed at closing Imam Khatib schools, something Erbakan unwillingly agreed to, but never implemented in practice. Erbakan relinquished power, having lasted less than a year as Prime Minister. The Refah party was banned soon after, a decision upheld by the European Court of Human Rights, and Erbakan was again banned from politics. As was usual in Turkish politics, another Islamist party was formed shortly after, named the Virtue Party, which by 2001 was also banned. This was the predicament the Islamists found themselves in at the turn of the millennium. Every time they formed a political outfit and got anywhere, they were cracked down on and forced to dissolve. Erdogan had decided that they had only one option, and that was to split with Erbakan and moderate. This was the founding of the AKP, the Justice and Development Party, a merger of numerous Islamic and centre-right factions. Indeed, that was the beauty of it. It was able to portray itself not as an Islamist force, but as a democratic and conservative one with the bright-eyed Erdogan at the fore. The next video will chart Erdogan's time in power and his ascent to the presidency. Thanks a lot for watching this video. If you liked the video, don't forget to click like and please do subscribe if you haven't done already. If you didn't like the video, click dislike and leave a comment and tell me where I went wrong. As always, huge thank you to all of my patrons. It's thanks to you that these videos are regular. If it's within your means to do so, then please do consider becoming a patron yourself. Thanks a lot guys, and until next time.